Welcome to our webinar. Our focus today is the science of reading. But before we even begin, we want to find out a little bit more about you and your experience with that phrase, science of reading. So let's start right off the bat by taking a poll. When you think about the science of reading, what comes to mind? We'll give it about 30 more seconds. All right, let's see what those results are. It looks like it was quite similar to what we may have expected. 70% are in decoding, about 22% think of background knowledge, and 7% think about vocabulary. So let's let that just sit there for a few minutes and do our welcome and introductions. So we're so glad you joined us for this event. I'm Lorraine Griffith. I'm Senior Content Architect for Humanities at Great Minds. During my teaching career with students at a wide range of grade levels, I focused on knowledge building and reading fluency. Those were the things that I just found incredibly interesting as I taught students. I retired to work full-time at Great Minds in the area of curriculum development. Before we get started, I want to share a few webinar logistics with you. Those of you attending today's session will be muted. Don't worry about sound, but please feel free to ask questions or pose your thoughts by finding the question feature on the right-hand side of your screen on the control panel. We'll be tracking your questions and comments throughout the discussion. We'll do our very best to address them at the end of the discussion. But if time doesn't allow for that, we will gladly follow up on any remaining questions via email. Everyone who registers will also receive access to a recording of today's session, which you are welcome to share away. So let's get started. Allow me to introduce our panel. I'm joined today by Jen Moran, who's an implementation leader at Great Minds. Jen, could you give us some info about yourself?
Yes, thanks, Lorraine. My name is Jen Moran, and like she said, I am an implementation leader with Great Minds, supporting districts pretty much on the East Coast with their implementation of Wit and Wisdom and Geodes. Prior to coming to Great Minds, I spent 13 years in Baltimore City Public Schools as a general educator, special educator, and literacy coach. And I was fortunate enough to be there when we adopted Wit and Wisdom in 2018. And I had the chance to be a classroom teacher of Wit and Wisdom at the 5th grade level, and then coach K through 5 Wit and Wisdom and Geodes. And then in some of my spare time, I have a serious passion for foundational literacy skills and the science of reading. So I also work as a national letters facilitator.
Well, welcome, Jen. We're so glad to have you and thankful for the incredible set of skills that you're bringing with you. Mandy, talk to us about your experience in the classroom and with coaching.
Yeah, so hi everybody, my name is Mandy Poland. I am an instructional coach working with kindergarten through 6th grade in Mad River Local Schools, which is near Dayton, Ohio. So this is my 23rd year in education. I think it's my 8th year in the coaching role. So the past several years, a big part of my job has been supporting Wit and Wisdom and Geodes implementation. And then I also work for Great Minds as a PD facilitator. So I've done that for 3 summers where I get to facilitate professional development with teachers. And so I am not a letters trainer, but I am a letters participant. So I'm halfway through and I'm kind of helping the logistical pieces with teachers in my district who are getting that training.
So some of you may be thinking that we're going to be talking about letters, but we're actually not. A week ago at the North Carolina Literacy Leaders Conference, I had the pleasure of hearing two very different speakers. Both were absolutely committed to the science of reading. In David Kilpatrick's introduction, it was interesting. He was very careful to say, I know I'll have questions afterwards, so I have this slide dedicated to all the important topics that I will not be covering in this talk, centered around the science of reading. Included on his list of what he would not be covering were vocabulary and reading comprehension. Well, the next day, the keynote was Natalie Wexler, author of The Knowledge Gap. Her focus was on all that David Kilpatrick had explicitly said he would not be discussed in his talk. So she, of course, focused on background knowledge, complex texts, writing to learn, and all of those variables that are brought to the science of reading in the area of reading comprehension. Since the onset of Emily Hanford's expose uncovering the widely used and ineffective reading instruction, much attention has been given to just one variable in the simple view of reading and one set of strands in Scarborough's reading rope. So as we begin, I, like David Kilpatrick, want to share what we will not be covering in our presentation today. What you saw in the poll was what we imagined was people's impressions of the science of reading, that if you teach decoding, you've taught the science of reading, which in fact is not true. We'll be talking about the language comprehension variable of the simple view and the upper part of Scarborough's reading rope. But be assured, we are still talking about the science of reading. Jen, could you talk to us a little bit, maybe an orientation around the simple view of reading for those that may not be familiar?
Yeah, let's set some background around the simple view of reading, which is a theoretical model that helps us understand assessment and instruction. So Goff and Tumner first introduced the simple view of reading back in 1986. So this has been around for a while. And they start with the purpose of reading, and that is to understand what one reads, right? We have to come to a consensus on that. And they propose a distinction between two broad skills that are required for reading comprehension. They define the simple view of reading as reading comprehension as the product, keyword there, the product of decoding, or also referred to as word recognition, times language comprehension. And it's really important to note that this is a static model. It's not a developmental one that shows the progression to reach proficiency. However, like I said, the implications are important for assessment and instruction. So by defining reading as the product rather than the sum of its two components, it claims that both components are necessary and neither are sufficient for reading success. And I think that's what we're trying to highlight here today. Essentially, what the simple view of reading shows is that if a student can quickly and effortlessly read the words in a passage presented to them, and if that same student can understand the same passage when read aloud to them, the assumption is that they should be able to comprehend it when they read it to themselves. So let's dig into this a little bit further and think through the implications for this. Before we talk about, the weight of each side of the equation, let's make sure that we are grounded and have a shared understanding of the definitions of its components. And so decoding, or like I said, word recognition, as it's sometimes referred to, is the ability to recognize printed words accurately and quickly. Language comprehension, keyword language comprehension, is the ability to extract and construct that literal and inferred meaning from speech. We have to remember that learning to read and write is laid on top of the foundation of our speech. So then finally, we achieve reading comprehension, and that's the ability to extract and construct literal and inferred meaning from print, okay? So let's take a closer look at this and see how this can play out with students in an actual classroom. If a student is weak, or we assign them a weight of 0 in decoding, and strong, or a weight of 1 in language comprehension, the product of that equation is 0, or insufficient for reading comprehension. Right? So back to Lorraine's poll, a lot of us thought the science of reading was really related to decoding, but we see the equation here. If a student is strong in decoding or a 1 and weak in language comprehension or a 0, the product of that equation is still 0 or insufficient for reading comprehension. So what's our goal as teachers? The goal is for students to be strong in both decoding and / word recognition and language comprehension in order to achieve reading comprehension. So we're going to spend some time today really talking about how we can support students in that language comprehension portion of the simple view of reading.
So many of you that are probably tuning in are familiar with our geodes because geodes are the books that students read while they're reading to learn. It's one of the things that we are really excited about that are in many of our K-2 classrooms and even beyond. The books complement and provide practice for the sound spelling patterns they're learning in their explicit phonics instruction program. Geodes also bridge from phonics to our core ELA program. So some people may ask, well, if you have the geodes and they're building knowledge, then why do you also need a core ELA program? I think what you're going to see as we talk through what a core ELA program offers to students, you'll see how geodes build knowledge in two different ways, through the readable text and through the text that they listen to at the end of the book. But students still need complex texts to build those language comprehension skills, and in the early years to build those listening comprehension skills. Today, we're going to start off by thinking about how those complex texts support the upper part of Scarborough's rope and that other variable that people don't typically talk a lot about, the language comprehension, in the simple view of reading. As Jen, as a 5th grade teacher, taught modules that she mentioned before. And Jen, could you take us through what teaching a complex text might have been like in your classroom in Baltimore?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been so excited to talk about this because even though I'm 3 or 4 years removed from teaching this module, it's one that I think about frequently and it just automatically puts a smile on my face. And so let me tell you sort of the story of 5th grade module 2. So 5th grade module 2 is titled Wordplay, and it explores the essential question, why do writers play with words? This module explores how authors use wordplay to engage audiences, create humor, meaning, and express themes. And the study centers on Norton Juster's classic modern fantasy novel, The Phantom Tollbooth, which pulses, as you know, with clever puns and vibrant wordplay. And Juster turns abstract concepts into concrete places, characters, and events in his imaginary land called the Kingdom of Wisdom. It's been turned upside down after its princesses, Rhyme and Reason, were banished to the castle in the air. Juster's young hero, Milo, a bored, disengaged young boy accustomed to wasting time and not accustomed to thinking, is whisked away to this fantastical land one day after traveling through a mysterious toll booth he discovers in his room. Milo soon discovers that he cannot navigate this strange world without thinking, especially if he's going to complete his quest to conquer the mountains of ignorance to rescue Rhyme and Reason. It's a really fun text that students get to read, but if you have read it, probably you know, also very complex. So how do we get students to attack this novel and make meaning of it to be able to answer that essential question, why do writers play with words? So throughout the module, students study the richness and the complexity of the English language from a humorous angle. The module begins with an exchange of riddles and jokes that rely on puns, literally like at the literal level. From there, students then watch and read Bud Abbott and Lou Costello's celebrated comedy routine, Who's on First, which illustrates how misunderstanding simple words can cause humor and confusion for audiences. And just to sort of highlight the knowledge building aspect of this, even though we had gone over puns, jokes, and riddles, the first time my students watched this sketch, it was silence. They didn't get it. And so through a deeper exploration of this text, in this case, a comedy sketch, students were able to, after watching it several times, end up like laughing hysterically once they got it, if you will. Norton Juster's The Phantom Tollbooth rightfully and resoundingly anchors this dynamic study of wordplay. Students encounter characters such as the watchdog named Talk, an insect named the Humbug, the spelling bee, and the math magician, along with many others. And they visit places such as the doldrums, Dictionopolis, the mountains of ignorance, and the islands of confusion, to name a few. Students study the words and actions of the characters and the descriptions of the various settings to analyze how their names are examples of wordplay. And for their end of module tasks, students employ a Jester-esque wordplay to write an exploded moment narrative in which Milo encounters one of the demons from the mountains of ignorance on his return journey and helps him resolve a conflict related to the wordplay of his name and his experiences in the Phantom Tollbooth by imparting wisdom he learned on his journey. And I have to say that when I first saw the end of module task prior to starting the module with my students, I was a little concerned. I had never asked students to complete writing tasks like this, and I didn't know how I was going to get students there. So I really just decided to trust the process and go ahead and teach the module as written to see where that got us. However, the beautifully integrated approach to lessons throughout the module led my students to produce some of the best writing I had ever seen in a 5th grade classroom. And I still periodically go back and read them when when I need a little humor in my day, because they were just that great.
How fortunate for those students and for the teacher. Like, how many times do we have assignments that we keep stacked up to go back and encourage ourselves with the product? It's really lovely. So as I was listening to you, I have to confess, I was not thinking about skills. I was following your telling of the characters and the interest in students getting Abbott and Costello and not getting it, and thinking about them being able to write to something that they were fascinated with, and this growing interest in the text. But we've billed this webinar as about the science of reading, and we've said we're going to talk about the top part of Scarborough's reading rope. So Jen, could you think back to that module when you taught it, maybe go into a little bit more detail and tease apart those strands so that we have a little bit deeper understanding of what is really in that integrated modular approach to teaching?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's revisit Scarborough's reading rope, focusing on those top strands around language comprehension. And I do have to admit that when I was first implementing wit and wisdom, I wasn't thinking of it as an isolated approach. The lessons were so well written that I wasn't necessarily thinking that we were working on background knowledge or literacy knowledge. But when I reflected on it, I saw that how all of these substrands under language comprehension were beautifully integrated together so that my students could produce that high quality writing at the end of that module task and really just have joy in the classroom. So let's start with background knowledge. So what are some of the things that we did in module 2 to build students' background knowledge? If you're familiar with Wit and Wisdom, we lead with inquiry, and we have a series of structured and sequential questions that students explore throughout the module. And I've highlighted a few of them here to show how students' ability to answer these questions helped them build some essential background knowledge that they needed in order to complete work later in the module. So as you can see in lessons 1 through 4, we explored the focusing question, how can wordplay create confusion and humor? And those were the lessons that we spent with that literal understanding of jokes, puns, and riddles. After that, we actually got started into the novel, and after reading a few chapters of the module's core text, we then answered the questions, why are snapshots important in stories, and especially in the Phantom Tollbooth? And if you've read that text, you know that the author, Norton Juster, uses the technique of snapshots to help tell that story. So it was important that students understood that narrative structure. That question in particular helped build our knowledge on narrative structure, but in 2 ways. 1, to understand the text that we were reading, and 2, to prepare students for the type of writing that they were going to be doing throughout the module and for that end of module task. Later in the module, after reading about half of the novel, we answered the question, how does the Phantom Tollbooth build my knowledge of how writers can play with words? And this allowed students to reflect on all of the knowledge they've built so far. So building that essential background knowledge and then reflecting on the knowledge that has been built throughout the module is a reoccurring routine that happens strategically throughout key points in that module. Let's go ahead and move down to vocabulary. So as you can imagine, reading a text like the Phantom Tollbooth and exploring wordplay is going to introduce students to a wide variety of new and interesting vocabulary. So how did we support students in not only deepening their vocabulary, but also broadening their vocabulary in this module? In lesson 2, students demonstrated the understanding of the word peculiar by studying the context and generating synonyms, examples, and non-examples. And as you can imagine, reading a text like the Phantom Tollbooth, understanding the word peculiar is going to be very important for their speaking in conversations, discussions, and also in their writing about that text. A few lessons later, in lesson 5, students explored the relationship between wisdom, knowledge, and ignorance to deepen their understanding of the word's meaning. Once again, these words are essential to understanding the novel's key themes, and you're going to see students using these words in their speaking and in their writing to communicate what they now know about the text. Later in lesson 9, students studied the meaning of the word surreal by analyzing its word parts. So what you'll notice here is we brought in some morphology. So there are several approaches to how we teach vocabulary. Not only do we teach it explicitly, but we have several approaches to how the students learn this vocabulary. In lesson 21, students applied the meaning of the prefix dis to understand the meanings of disconsolate and dissonance. So once again, using that morphology to help them understand the meanings of words. And then finally, in lesson 30, we verified meanings of unknown words using a dictionary and applied these meanings to understand what some of the demons of ignorance, these are characters in the novel, represent in the Phantom Tollbooth. So as you can see, we took an integrated approach to vocabulary instruction. So it's all within the context of studying the text. Not only was their breadth of vocabulary increased, but also the attention to the precision of those word meanings was addressed as well. So now as we get deeper into these strands of the language comprehension portion of Scarborough's reading rope, I think that background knowledge and vocabulary sort of tend to be something that, well, I know I was most comfortable with, and maybe others, and it was these remaining strands of this portion of the reading rope that were a little bit harder to think about how they're actually integrated in a cohesive way. So let me talk about how I saw, for example, language structures show up in 5th grade module 2. So to be clear, language structures involves understanding syntax, so that permissible word order, and semantics, word and phrase meanings and relationships. So let's look at a few examples of how we supported students in their work of language structures. Once again, going back to lesson 2, this is going to sound a little familiar to the vocabulary piece. Students deepen their understanding of semantics by demonstrating that understanding of the word peculiar, right? By studying its context and generating those synonyms. Then in lesson 5, we talked about wisdom, knowledge, and ignorance to deepen their understanding of each word's meaning. And in lesson 27, students demonstrate their understanding of the word trivial by examining synonyms and antonyms and explaining what the main character Milo learns from performing trivial tasks. So as you can see, all the work around language structures was integrated in order for students to deepen their understanding of the text, rather than an isolated approach just for the sake of teaching language structures. And I think that's an important distinction to make. From there, let's talk about verbal reasoning. And this includes the ability to make inferences and understand that figurative language, such as metaphors. So here are a few examples of how students worked on their verbal reasoning skills throughout 5th grade module 2. In lesson 6, students infer word meanings based on descriptions and illustrations of setting and characters in the Phantom Toll Booth and explain how their names are examples of wordplay. This is once again one of those reoccurring structures that we dove into each time there was a new character or a new setting introduced. The essential question is, why do writers play with words? And so it was really important that students were able to make inferences about the word meanings and those connections to characters' names and setting names in order to understand the text. In lesson 7, students made observations and inferences about the king's advisor from their dialogue. And then I've highlighted in the blue boxes a couple questions from this graphic organizer specifically. So specifically how they did this, they were asked to reflect on the setting and characters and how it's an example of wordplay and make inferences about the wisdom Milo is gaining from going to these places and interacting with these characters. Later in lesson 7, students have to analyze the new character by making this inference about the wordplay in their name. And then I've included just a snapshot from the teacher's edition where they're asked a further probing question to deepen their work in this area. They are then provided with the definition of short shrift to better understand the wordplay of the character Officer Short Shrift. And they're asked, how does this definition compare with your inference? How does knowing the definition of short shrift help you better understand Officer Short Shrift's personality? So it's not just understanding and making inferences for the sake of making inferences. You'll probably keep hearing me say this. It's all integrated for students to have a better understanding of that grade level complex text. And finally, I will move on to literacy knowledge. So as we know, literacy knowledge involves understanding concepts of print as well as text structures of various genres. And the Phantom Toll Booth is a literary text, so students spend a significant amount of time in this module exploring narrative text structures and analyzing how Norton Juster uses these structures to tell his humorous story. So let's take a look at a few examples. Students examine narrative structure throughout the module to help them understand the structure of those various scenes in the text, but also to prepare to write their own narrative scenes. So in lesson 16, students analyzed how events in chapter 8 of the Phantom Toll Booth fit into the overall hero's quest, sort of a sub genre of narrative text. And they do that by summarizing the conflict and the call of Milo's hero's quest. Later on in the module, in lesson 17, students examine chapter structure by using the mnemonic ESCAPE, which stands for establish, setting, characters, action, problem, and ending, to organize what's happening in various chapters and scenes, and to prepare for their own writing. Once again, this is one of these consistent routines that students use throughout the module. This all culminated when students complete that end of module task that I mentioned earlier, where they bring all of this learning together in order to write their own exploded moment scene, in which Milo encounters one of the demons from the mountains of ignorance on his return journey and helps him resolve a conflict related to the wordplay of his name and his experiences in the Phantom Toll Booth by conveying wisdom related to the story's central themes. A lot of work had to be done to get students to be able to produce writing and respond to that task. And it wasn't until I was kind of just like shocked, like maybe they were just good at narrative writing. But when I really reflect back on the module, it was the integration of all of those language comprehension strands, plus, the strong word recognition that they had developed in the early grades that came together to allow them to deeply understand this complex text and to be able to write in the style of this complex text.
And I think maybe, Jen, thank you, that whole integration of all of those strands is what kind of masks the work from the students. It's so different than pulling out a different, we used to call them ditto sheets, but I guess runoffs, that would just try to zero in on a skill and then pull back. When it's fully integrated, they can't do it without accessing background knowledge for whatever they do. So even in the student experience with assessment, there's so much integration of skills that they are writing a story based on the knowledge, but they're not realizing how much inference work they're doing because they have all of this knowledge of the wordplay to pull from. So it makes the student engagement and the teacher engagement so much more meaningful because of that integrated teaching and learning. Yeah, thank you so much. So because it makes more sense to the students and it's more interesting, in the past few years, we've had more hurdles to jump with having this level of instruction um, given to students, even when remote learning has been made a requirement. So Mandy, I know that you moved out of your coaching position to work with students in a remote setting last year and taught Wit and Wisdom. I would love for you to talk about that experience a little bit and then go through the same routine that Jen did, where you give us kind of a scene of what you did in grade 3, and then when you tease apart those strands, where do you see the pieces in that whole?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I've been a coach for many years, and last year, because of, just the world we're living in, we had to kind of transition to a remote classroom. So I was really excited um, to go back to the classroom and actually teach this curriculum I had been supporting other teachers on with my very own students. So I used InSync, I used the Learn Anywhere plan, and I was really thankful to have this curriculum that I trusted to have all of these pieces. Um, so the first module that I did ended up being my favorite, and that was module 1, the sea. And the essential question for that module is, why do people explore the sea? So we began the module by reading Sarah Teasdale's poem, The Sea Wind, and studying Katsushika Hokusai's woodblock print, The Great Wave. So students continued answering the first focusing question, which is, how do artists explore the sea, by reading William Steig's tale of unlikely friends in Amos and Boris. Students wrote paragraphs about the central message of Amos and Boris, using all the details about the sea, which was the setting of the story, and then using some very domain-specific vocabulary. We then shifted to informational texts to answer the focusing question, why and how do scientists explore the sea? So first we read The Fantastic Undersea Life of Jacques Cousteau, learning all about Jacques Cousteau's passion for exploring the sea and how that led him to developing technology to support his exploration. Students expanded their writing by now writing 2 different paragraphs describing how and why scientists explore the sea and creating illustrations to support what they were writing. The next focusing question is, why and how do scientists explore sea creatures? So students then are further deepening their knowledge by reading Shark Attack and the Giant Squid Searching for Sea Monsters. And in these texts, they are learning the truth about a normally feared sea creature of the shark. And one of my very favorite classes was when students were debating during a Socratic seminar about studying sharks, right? Is it more beneficial or is it too dangerous? So students were citing evidence from the text. They were joyfully disagreeing with each other. And really all of that was in support of the end of module task, which is the culmination of the module, where they're writing multiple paragraphs to answer the question, why do people explore the sea? And just like you, Jen, I, as a classroom teacher prior to Wit and Wisdom, never had students, especially that early in the year, writing multiple paragraphs, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things I heard in yours, Jen, and in Mandy's, this whole idea of having the assessment so much a part of your instruction that it's really integrated as well, and pulling in real background knowledge, vocabulary that they've worked with, but now they have to use because they're writing with it. So much more effective than pulling out a generic reading comprehension test. And so the task, the EOM, the Socratic seminars, they're all rooted in knowledge. And once again, it's integrated, not isolated. So can you do kind of an x-ray for us of what you just described, like taking it apart strand by strand? I didn't mean to interrupt you. Keep going. Thanks.
No, that's great. Yeah, so when I first began to reflect on this module, it was really hard for me to think about each of the different substrands. Um, we've said many times, right? This curriculum is beautifully integrated, and it's really easy for us to overlook all of these things that have been very intentionally built in. So I really enjoyed this process of kind of reflecting on each of the substrands and pulling apart all of the intricate pieces that when I was teaching every day through Zoom, kind of in the trenches, the day by day, I was not able to see. So we're going to start with that top strand of background knowledge, and we'll talk about what we did there. So we began by studying the Sea Wind poem and looking at the Great Wave woodblock print. Students very, very quickly built their knowledge about the sea. You might be surprised by how many of my third graders had never seen the ocean before. But that understanding of the sea that we built through the poem and the artwork really helped them to understand the setting of the next text, which was Amos and Boris, and how the friendship that forms between a mouse and a whale was so unique. Moving now to the next thread, which is vocabulary. I'd love to share just a little bit about some of the work my class did with vocabulary. So as a coach, during the first year of implementation, I remember being blown away going into third grade classrooms by the vocabulary that the third graders began using during, just this early part of third grade. Vocabulary was always something that the teachers that I work with and I knew we needed to improve, but we never really found a way to make that work. So this module about the sea has so many big words, right? Multi-syllable words, scientific words that students really authentically learn. They're learning the words by listening to the text read aloud to them, by having discussions with their peers, and by actually using them in their writing. Far different than what I had done in the past with a word a day or writing down definitions, right? Another place that was a great place to kind of unpack vocabulary and morphology was the fluency passages. We dug into some words like bioluminescent and luminous in a passage from Amos and Boris, and seeing those connections with the morphology of the word part of luminous. Then another example is during a Socratic seminar, my students were practicing, they had the opportunity to practice using that content vocabulary. So this is in sense a verbal rehearsal that's preparing them to write about their content knowledge. My students corrected misconceptions in the pronunciation of words, the meanings of words. One in particular that I remember is the word squalene that was found in the Shark Attack book. And they just thought that was the funniest word, but we talked about it and they were able to use it correctly during their discussions and in their writing. All right, let's move on now to language structures. So during this module, there are lots and lots of deep dives that hit on the thread of language structure. But for me, doing remote instruction and meeting with students solely through Zoom and following the Learn Anywhere plan, like so many other teachers out there, we had to make really tough instructional decisions, right? We had to prioritize. So rather than isolating instruction on language structures, we really hit on this thread kind of throughout our regular work, routine work with fluency. So every module has these fluency passages, and they're key passages from the module texts that really help students practice reading over, or that students do practice reading over and over again. And with these passages, we were able to highlight sentence structures and phrases right there within the context of the text they were practicing and reading anyway. All right, so we're going to move on now to verbal reasoning. So the texts in this module provide lots of opportunities for students to practice this verbal reasoning thread, which includes making inferences and understanding figurative language. So while we were reading the Sea Wind poem, the students look for things that could not happen in real life. This is how they found examples of figurative language in the poem. We discussed phrases like the sea wind comes whispering, how that's not something that literally happens, but it's a way that the writer can help readers to think more deeply about the poem. Another example of non-literal language is when Sarah Teasdale describes the wind as a far off beautiful sound, and then she contrasts that with the far off terrible call. And so this contrast really helps students to infer that central message of the poem, that the sea can be both beautiful and dangerous. All right, one of the things I love about Wit and Wisdom is that these modules are built on really rich texts. So students are exposed to so many genres, and there's a lot of opportunity for implicit and explicit teaching moments around those text types and the features and the structures within them. They really build that strand of literacy knowledge in so many ways. So in this grade 3 module of the Sea, my students anyway, especially enjoyed the Jacques Cousteau book. We analyzed his words through quotes that existed in little bubbles throughout the text. And then in Shark Attack, my students learn, or all students learn about text boxes and captions and illustrations. So in both of these two examples, the students are learning how authors use those text features in an informational text to provide more information to the reader. And students are deepening their literary knowledge through the variety of genres that are represented in each module. You can see just on the graphic here, there's informational, I've mentioned artwork, there's poetry, there's literary, there's even videos. So lots of different genres where students are building knowledge.
Thank you, Mandy, and thank you, Jen, for taking us into your classroom and showing us how those integrated modules actually hold a lot of isolated skills, but they're so integrated you don't even know what's happening. You have to discipline yourself to stop and say, what did we really do in that lesson to cover that? And if I could just go back to the idea of Scarborough's rope and realize how it's not just the bottom part of it with the word recognition portion that is helping our students to learn to read. It's really the combination of that bottom portion with all of those strands at the top. And if I could be totally vulnerable for a moment, most of my career I taught without curriculum. And I would start being really convinced that I'm not spending enough time on one. I didn't know Scarborough's reading rope at that point, but I would think I'm not spending enough time on working on different genres. So I'd get really psyched about it. And I'd go to the library and I'd pull out all different genres on a topic, and then we would read around those genres. But then I would think, oh, I'm not spending enough time on vocabulary. And I'd run to the library and get vocabulary. But there's something about having this level of integration and being able to justify it by looking at Hollis Scarborough's brilliant. I mean, think about how long this rope has been out there, and that it's still really helping us to know when a curriculum is whole, including that top part, and when explicit phonics instruction is sufficient to accomplish that bottom part. But one of the things that I would really love to talk about just for a minute is something that kind of puzzled me as I was looking at this in preparation for doing this webinar. And it's interesting to me because at the bottom it says that that word recognition portion becomes increasingly automatic. This is all involved in becoming a fluent reader. And the top of it becomes increasingly strategic. Could you talk to me a little bit about how you see the difference of that increasingly automatic with the bottom part of the rope and the increasingly strategic at the top? Maybe with some examples.
Yeah, every time I look at Scarborough's reading rope, I understand it more deeply, right? And so I'm appreciating you pointing those things out. Thinking about how we want students to be fluent readers, right? I'm thinking about all the time I spent with the fluency passages with my students and just connecting all of those strands together through the fluency passage. They were building knowledge, they were noticing luminous, right? They were noticing all those word parts really authentically, and that it was really just driving that conversation. We were able to unpack so much through the fluency passages. So that's what I'm thinking of right now.
Mhm.
I think depending on the grade level you teach, you might think of fluency sort of two different ways, right? So if you're an early grades teacher, you're thinking more of fluency is like how fast can they recognize these words in a given time, right? And if you're an upper elementary teacher, you're thinking of fluency of reading with expression and phrasing and intonation. And so I think the way I see it and the way these two things come together is that that solid word recognition, hopefully ideally established in the early grades, is going to free up that mental cognitive load to allow students as they go through their educational career to become increasingly strategic in how they approach reading a text, right? So if you're going to be able to read a passage with appropriate phrasing and expression, you have to have literary knowledge, because if you see words that are in dialogue tags and quotation marks, you have to know that that triggers something in the way that you read that text. If you see a metaphor, you might phrase that differently in the way that you're reading that. And in turn, by reading with appropriate phrasing, expression, and intonation, you're going to be increasing your comprehension as well. Have you ever listened to somebody read something with no expression, right? It's very hard to understand what they're saying. So it's all kind of working together. And just like the rope illustrates, we have to be quick, effortless, and automatic in our word recognition, but we still have to address the upper strands of that reading rope so that students can be strategic to read that full picture of fluency, the final outcome of the ability not only to read quickly and effortlessly, but also with appropriate phrasing, expression, and intonation.
One of the really good things that I've read recently came from Unbound to Ed, and they were talking about building students um, like their own concept of ability in that they felt like they could read these complex texts. And one of the ways that you can really do that with your students is to have them very often, maybe daily, but looking at a passage that you're focusing on and have them do a repeat reading. The interesting thing about that whole idea that really does build confidence in your classroom that these books, I guarantee you, Jen, when you pulled out that Phantom Tollbooth, your kids probably said something like, I think this is too hard for us. Like you have it at the wrong grade level. But then as they start to develop those ideas of, oh, I'm kind of getting why these names are, maybe I can understand this passage because I paid attention to the name. Maybe as you're doing fluency passages where they're doing repeated readings of section of the book, they say, oh, I did that 10 pages ago, so I can probably do that here. And what you're doing is now you're integrating the top of the rope with the bottom of the rope, of having them really think about, I'm becoming increasingly automatic with my word recognition and my phrasing and all the hurdles that come with reading fluency. So I'm freeing up the cognitive space. And now I can go into the actual content of what I'm reading. I can think about, I loved your example of the short shrift. If I know what that actually means, I'm going to understand this paragraph. I personally remember when I read Phantom Tollbooth, how I was confused at the beginning. And then the farther I got in the book, the more I realized they're telling me what to comprehend here. They're telling me what the main thing is about this character by the name. But it stays with you, like and it weaves as you go that you're able to be more strategic for the rest of Phantom Tollbooth. But then when you pick up another book that has some kind of repeating idea or technique in it, you realize, oh, this is something to pick up on. Just like Mandy, when you were talking about noticing word roots. Once you get strategic with noticing what's inside a word, all of a sudden you're becoming increasingly strategic with vocabulary, or you understand what an appositive phrase is. You're increasingly strategic with knowing what that word means instead of pausing to look it up in the dictionary. So, yeah, it's really the blending of all of that. And it's probably a really good discipline to parse it apart and kind of x-ray what's happening in your classroom, so that you see how those strands and really strong instruction, how that happens. So do you have anything else that you wanted to add before we close out today?
My final thought is that just how grateful I was to be provided with a high quality aligned curriculum, because this exercise of breaking it apart highlighted for me how difficult it would be and how very time consuming it would be for me to try to replicate this type of instruction on my own if I was writing it from scratch. It really allowed me to free up my ability to focus on my students and respond to what they were doing and their needs, rather than spending hours trying to create lessons that met all of these strands. So that's just sort of after doing this process, my overall reflection.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I have said for years, this is a curriculum I wish I could have written. Um, but I think going through this process, I have an even deeper appreciation for how all of these upper strands, which honestly I haven't put as much thought into as I have the lower strands, right? And so just going through and like really thinking this through, prepping for today, um, I have a deeper understanding myself. So I really appreciate even more, just like you said.
Well, we want to just thank everyone. First of all, thank you, Mandy and Jen. You put a lot of work into going into those lessons and really taking them apart. So we really appreciate that. And I feel like I understand the definitions of each strand so much better by seeing it illustrated. That was so good for me to see. And I just want to tell everyone that is listening today and will listen in the future our great appreciation for your coming to the webinar. We'll be sending out a link, and we encourage you, as I said earlier, to share it widely. So we've enjoyed having you with us today. Good afternoon.